I don't know how to explain what it feels like to stand on that stretch of sand when the town is asleep. Most people see the beach as a place of escape. Families spread out towels in the summer sun. Kids run screaming toward the tide. And tourists photograph sunsets as if they're collecting proof that beauty is still real in this world. But at night, when the boardwalk empties and the last drunk stumbles home, the beach becomes something else entirely. Something vast, hungry, and alive. I was 16 the first time I walked down there after dark. My father caught me halfway to the surf, grabbed my arm so hard it left a bruise, and told me never to come back alone at night. He never explained why. He didn't need to. His face carried the kind of dread I didn't question. By the time I turned 19, I thought I was braver, maybe even immune to whatever superstition haunted him. That's when I took the job as a lifeguard. The shoreline here is different than other places. The sand doesn't glitter with shells or glass. It looks dull, almost gray, and when you walk across it at night, it doesn't crunch underfoot. It sighs. The water itself doesn't roar against the coast like you'd expect. The tide rolls in too quietly, a slow creep, like it's sneaking back to reclaim something it lost. Even the gulls don't linger after dusk. They vanish inland, leaving the sky empty, as if they know better. The tower they assigned me is tall enough to see the entire curve of the bay. By day, it feels almost safe. Kids screaming, radios blaring from cars in the lot, the metallic smell of sunscreen heavy in the air. But when the sun dips and the crowd evaporates, the tower feels like a coffin on stilts. Wooden planks creak under my weight, and the salt wind claws at my skin like fingers. I've never felt so elevated and so trapped at the same time. The town relies on us, though. Tourists pour in every summer, and the council needs lifeguards to keep up appearances. We're a safe place, the brochures insist. A peaceful retreat. They don't print the drownings, the missing persons, or the whispers that pass through town meetings like bad weather reports. Nobody wants to vacation at a haunted beach. I've met the other guards, but none of them talk much about the strange things. They trade stories sometimes, usually half drunk after long shifts. I saw a swimmer past midnight, one will mutter, or something brushed my leg out there, too big to be a fish. But then they laugh it off, drown their unease in beer, and change the subject. It's easier that way. For me, though, the silence is worse. I've always had this instinct, this gnawing urge to look too closely, to listen too hard. Maybe it's why I notice things others ignore, like the way the waves never follow the wind. They lap in rhythms that don't match the storm patterns overhead. Or how sometimes the footprints leading to the water never return. I've measured them, traced them with my flashlight, and I know what I saw. Steps walk straight into the surf and disappear, as if the sea swallowed them whole. The locals live with it in their own way. Some avoid the beach entirely. Others keep rituals, spreading salt across thresholds, never leaving windows open at night, refusing to speak of the sea after sundown. I thought it was just folklore, the kind of old-world superstition carried down by fishermen and widows. But then I noticed how carefully they avoided the shoreline, even on the hottest nights when the air was thick and unbreathable inland. It wasn't just fear, it was obedience. When I started the job, my supervisor handed me a laminated sheet. Rules, he said. Safety protocols. At first, they looked ordinary enough. Don't swim alone, keep the tower lit, always check the rip currents. But buried among the practicalities were lines that made no sense. Do not whistle after dark. Do not answer voices from the surf. Never turn your back to the water, even when the tide recedes. He didn't explain them. He didn't have to. The way he looked at me as I read, waiting to see if I'd laugh, told me everything. I didn't laugh. I signed the contract. Even before the rules, I knew the ocean held things we weren't meant to understand. My earliest memory is of standing knee-deep in the water, watching something massive move beneath the waves, too large, too steady to be driftwood. My father yanked me out before I saw its shape, but the ripple it left behind lived in me. The feeling of being observed, measured, judged. Sometimes when I sit in the tower at night, that feeling returns. The sea looks flat, featureless, but my gut twists as though hundreds of eyes are opening beneath the surface, all trained on me. The longer I stare, the harder it is to breathe. I force myself to look away, scan the empty beach, remind myself I'm imagining it. But deep down, I know I'm not. I've learned the town's history in fragments. People vanish here more often than they should. Fishermen, swimmers, even joggers who stray too close to the tide. Their names are carved into weathered plaques in the town square, brushed clean every spring but always added to year after year. Some deaths get explanations, riptides, boating accidents, storms. But others linger as unsolved, bodies never recovered. The ocean keeps what it takes. Everyone here knows that. Nobody says it out loud. I wish I could describe the silence better. It's not the absence of sound. It's the presence of something else, heavier than quiet, pressing down until your ears ring. Sometimes it comes suddenly. One moment the waves murmur, the next the air collapses. My skin prickles when it happens, as though the sea is holding its breath, waiting. The longer I work here, the more I realize this place isn't just a beach. It's a border, a thin, fragile edge between what belongs to us and what doesn't. And every night I feel the line eroding. There are moments when I almost convince myself it's all in my head. That the rules are just traditions, the vanishings just bad luck, the silence just my nerves. Then I hear it. The faintest hum carried on the wind, too low for language but too deliberate to be chance. It rises from the water like a choir underwater, singing to no one, or maybe to me. I don't hum back. I don't answer. And yet, every night when my shift ends and I trudge back inland, the sand clinging to my ankles, I feel it following. The tide creeping closer, the whisper of something that never sleeps. The laminated sheet sat on my desk for days before I could bring myself to read it properly. I'd glanced at it when my supervisor handed it over, nodding like it was just another training manual. But that night, when the air was still and the tide whispered against the shore, I spread it out beneath the harsh light of my lamp and traced each rule with my finger. The first few lines made sense, the kind of bullet points you'd find in any handbook. Always maintain a clear line of sight from the tower. Check flotation equipment daily. Monitor children closely. The basics of keeping people alive. But then, halfway down the page, the rules shifted. They weren't suggestions. They weren't safety reminders. They were warnings. Do not whistle after dark. Do not speak to anyone standing beyond the tide line. If you see figures in the surf, do not attempt rescue after sunset. Keep the tower light burning at all times. Never let it go out. Never turn your back on the water, even when it recedes. The final rule was handwritten in thick black marker at the bottom of the page, pressed over the laminate as though someone added it after the fact. Do not answer when the sea calls your name. I remember leaning back in my chair, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. It would have been easy to laugh. Easy to shrug it off as superstition. Some leftover nonsense from fishermen who couldn't face the randomness of the ocean. But there was nothing funny in the way those rules were written. No smiley faces or underlines for emphasis. Just cold, simple commands. I asked my supervisor about them the next morning. He was an older man, weather-beaten, the kind of face that looks carved from salt and wind. His eyes were always tired, as if he hadn't slept properly in years. When I brought up the rules, he didn't deny them. He didn't brush them off. He only looked at me long enough to make me uncomfortable, then said, "Follow them, and you'll last longer than most." That was all. It gnawed at me. If they were meant as jokes, he would have smiled. If they were meaningless, he would have waved me off. But he didn't. He treated them with the same weight you'd give to instructions on how to keep breathing. I carried the sheet in my backpack everywhere, pulling it out when no one was around, reading it over and over. Each time I did, the words settled deeper into me. I began to see them less as superstition and more as a framework for survival. On my second week, I understood why. The tower light had a bad connection, flickering whenever the wind rattled the wires. One night it cut out completely. For a few seconds I sat in absolute darkness, the beach swallowed in shadow. Then I saw them, 3 shapes standing ankle-deep in the surf, motionless. They weren't swimmers. I knew every swimmer that had been out that day, and none wore clothes like these. Their outlines looked wrong, too thin, too tall. My first instinct was to call out, to ask if they needed help, but the rule burned in my mind. Do not speak to anyone standing beyond the tide line. I froze. The light flickered back on, buzzing like an angry insect. The The shapes were gone. The water rippled where they'd been, but the sand bore no footprints. After that, I stopped doubting the handbook. Every rule carried weight. I tested one once without meaning to. Whistling was a habit of mine. Some tune from childhood I caught myself humming or pushing through my lips. One night during a long, empty watch, I whistled without thinking. The sound carried over the waves, thin and sharp. At once, the silence deepened. The tide seemed to pause. Then faintly another whistle answered. Not mocking, not echoing, answering. It rose from the surf in the same pitch, the same rhythm. I clamped my mouth shut, heart hammering, and never whistled again. The other lifeguards avoided talking about the rules. When I asked one, a guy named Evan, he shook his head quickly and muttered, "Don't bring it up. Not here." His eyes darted toward the water, even though we were off duty, standing in the bar. He left his drink half finished and walked out. It wasn't until later, digging through the town library's archives, that I found proof these rules weren't new. In an old binder of local records, dated back to the 1950s, I saw a typed sheet, rules for beach watchmen. The wording was nearly identical. They hadn't changed in 70 years. If anything, the modern list was shorter. One line in the original list had been removed entirely. Bury salt in the sand at the foot of your tower. Replace it weekly. I never learned why that one disappeared. The more I studied the handbook, the more I began to feel like the rules weren't just meant to keep swimmers safe. They were meant to keep us, the ones watching, from slipping into whatever lay beneath. Because something lived in that water, something that listened, it became harder to shake the sense that the rules were written by survivors, not by officials. They were warnings passed down by those who'd seen too much and lived long enough to write them out for the next poor soul who took the job. And yet there was always a question gnawing at me. If the rules were all it took, why did so many still vanish? I'd walked past the plaques in the town square. I'd heard the names whispered at bonfires. Too many people had obeyed, and still the sea took them. Some nights, as I sat in the tower with the handbook clutched tight in my hand, I felt a bitter truth pressing closer. Maybe the rules weren't meant to save us at all. Maybe they only delayed the inevitable. The first night alone in the tower felt like being dropped into a cage with invisible bars. From the ground, the structure looks harmless enough. Just a tall wooden box with a ladder nailed into its side. But once you're up there, it becomes something else. The tower sways when the wind picks up. It groans, as if the salt in the air has soaked so deep into the wood that it's rotting from the inside out. And beneath it, always, the tide rolls in and out, waiting. I climbed up at dusk, the sun bleeding out across the horizon. The beach emptied slowly, families dragging coolers across the sand, couples wandering off the boardwalk, kids tossing frisbees one last time before being pulled away by tired parents. Their laughter dissolved into the air, thinner with every step they took inland, until the only sounds left were the waves and the cries of a few gulls circling overhead. When the last car pulled out of the lot, silence pressed down like a heavy blanket. I locked the tower door behind me and tried to settle into the seat. My flashlight sat by my side. The handbook rules were taped to the inside wall, staring back at me like scripture. I forced myself to breathe slow, to keep calm, but my chest felt tight, as if the sea air was already inside me. Hours passed. The sky darkened into a dull bruise, clouds blotting out the moon. I kept the tower light burning, its beam sweeping the sand in rhythmic arcs. Each time it swung out over the water, I caught myself leaning forward, squinting. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a swimmer too stubborn to leave. Maybe nothing. The first time I saw movement, I thought my eyes were betraying me. A figure stood waist-deep in the surf, maybe 30 yards out. Too far to make out details, but close enough to see the dark outline of a head, shoulders, arms hanging unnaturally still. My training told me to blow the whistle, shout, climb down, and run to them. But the rules stopped me cold. Do not attempt rescue after sunset. Do not speak to anyone standing beyond the tide line. I sat frozen, my mouth dry, gripping the edge of the seat until my knuckles ached. The figure didn't move. Not a shift, not a ripple. Just stood there, as if waiting. The water around it didn't behave right either. It didn't break against its waist. It lapped past, rolling in as though the figure wasn't there at all. I snapped on the flashlight, cutting the beam directly across the surf. The light struck the water, gleaming off the ripples. But the figure was gone. No splash, no retreat, no sinking shape, just empty water. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe I had, but I couldn't shake the sense that something had been staring back at me, patient, curious. I didn't whistle. I didn't call out. I remembered the handbook and obeyed. The night dragged on, thick with unease. The tower groaned against the wind, and the beam of the light flickered every so often, sputtering as if the darkness tried to swallow it whole. Each time it dimmed, my chest clenched. I'd stare at the water, terrified the figure would return in the gap between one sweep and the next. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. A voice, soft, low, carried on the tide. Help. One word. Stretched and warped by the air, but clear enough that I jerked upright in my seat. I aimed the flashlight. Heart racing. Nothing. Just the steady roll of black waves. Please. This time closer, though the waterline hadn't changed. My throat tightened. It wasn't a scream or a cry. It was steady, measured, like someone repeating a word they didn't quite understand. I bit down hard on my lip, reminding myself, do not answer voices from the surf. My pulse thundered so loudly I could hardly hear the waves anymore. The voice came a third time, but not from the water. It came from behind me. I spun, light flashing across the empty tower. Nothing. Just the wall, the taped rules, the open window letting in the sea air. When I turned back to the surf, the beach looked empty again. The voice was gone. The silence returned, heavier than before. I stayed rigid in that seat until dawn broke, every muscle locked in place. I didn't move. I didn't even blink for long stretches. When the first hint of sunlight touched the horizon, something shifted. The silence cracked, and the gulls returned, crying overhead. The ocean regained its sound, rolling and crashing as if nothing had happened. I climbed down the ladder with stiff legs, sand crunching under my boots. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped the flashlight. On the walk back inland, I passed a single set of footprints leading into the water. They weren't mine. They weren't fresh. The tide hadn't erased them, and they didn't come back out. By the time my 4th week on the job began, I'd stopped telling myself that what I saw in the surf was a trick of the eyes. Too many nights had passed with too many strange shapes, too many whispers rising above the water like breath from a mouth pressed against my ear. The beach wasn't quiet anymore, not in the way most people mean it. It had grown alive with sounds no one should hear. It started subtly. Little things. When the tide slid in at dusk, I began to notice words buried inside the crash of the waves. At first I thought it was my imagination, pareidolia, the way our brains pull patterns from static. But no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the syllables became clearer. They threaded through the surf like threads of smoke. Sometimes it was my name. Sometimes it was fragments of sentences. Stay. Come closer. Don't leave. Each time I gripped the edges of the Lifeguard tower, forcing myself not to move. The handbook's rules were etched into my mind now, flashing behind my eyes. Do not answer voices from the surf. And yet the pull of them was unbearable. The voices weren't desperate. They weren't even threatening. They were patient, persuasive, as if they knew eventually my body would give in where my mind resisted. During the day, nothing seemed wrong. Tourists laid their towels on the sand. Children ran screaming into the waves. Couples floated lazily on inflatables. I'd sit in the tower, scanning with binoculars, watching them splash in the same water that whispered to me at night. The contrast made me dizzy. Nobody else seemed to notice. Or maybe they pretended not to. The locals certainly noticed. That much was clear. One evening just before my shift, I stopped at the corner store for a bottle of water. The clerk, an old woman with hair as white as driftwood, narrowed her eyes as I placed my change on the counter. "You're one of them," she muttered. I frowned. "One of who?" "Tower rats!" she spat. Her teeth were small and gray. "You sit up there and listen too long. You think you're safe because you're above the sand. You're not. I didn't answer." What could I say? She shoved the coins back at me with a hand that trembled slightly. I left without another word. That night, The whispers grew bolder. They no longer waited for the tide to come close. Even when the waves were far out, dragging themselves back toward the horizon, I could hear them crawling across the sand. They slithered over the dunes, curling around the wooden legs of the tower. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound vibrated inside my skull. "Why do you watch? Why don't you come down? We are waiting." The worst part was the familiarity. The voices weren't strangers. They borrowed tones I knew. My father, my mother, old friends I hadn't seen in years. Once I swear I heard my own voice calling from the water. I stopped sleeping. When my shift ended, I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, hearing the ocean in my blood. I dreamed of the surf rising to my window, pressing against the glass, whispering through the cracks. By the sixth night, exhaustion blurred everything together. I remember sitting in the tower, swaying slightly, fighting to keep my eyes open. The rules demanded I never turn my back on the sea, but fatigue is a crueler enemy than fear. I blinked too long and my head slumped forward. When I jerked awake, the voices weren't whispers anymore. They were chants, dozens of them, hundreds, rising and falling in unison, like the rhythm of waves, like the rhythm of breath. The sound wasn't outside, it was everywhere, swelling in my bones, vibrating the wood of the tower, rattling the glass in the searchlight. I staggered to my feet, gripping the railing, shining the flashlight across the water. And there they were, shapes. Not one, not two, but dozens, all standing waist-deep in the surf, perfectly still, perfectly aligned, as if they'd risen from the sand together. Their heads tilted upward, faces hidden in shadow, but their mouths moved with the chant. The beam of the light swept across them, and they didn't vanish this time. They only stopped moving their mouths. The silence that followed was worse than the chant. Then, together, every head turned toward me. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the bench. My flashlight slipped from my hands, clattering against the wood. By the time I scrambled for it, shaking, they were gone. The water stretched empty before me, black and endless. I thought I was losing my mind. But the next morning, when I climbed down from the tower, I saw something carved into the wet sand at the tide line. Letters, drawn by no hand I could see, etched too deeply for the waves to erase. My name. I stared at it until the sun rose high enough to dry it out. By noon, the letters had vanished, as though they'd never been there. The handbook rules rattled in my skull all day. Do not speak to anyone beyond the tide line. Do not answer voices from the surf. But what about when the voices wrote instead of spoke? What about when they knew my name? Every night after, I felt my resolve thinning. The whispers came faster, sharper, more insistent. My name tangled in every syllable, over and over, until I heard it even when the waves were calm. I stopped trying to drown it out. I knew eventually I would have to face what was calling me. The third rule of the handbook said it plain. If you see figures in the surf, do not attempt rescue after sunset. I repeated that line to myself like a prayer every night in the tower. I had already seen the shapes, already heard the voices, already felt the pull of the tide. Each time I obeyed. Each time I sat frozen, clenching my teeth, whispering under my breath, "Don't move, don't move, don't move," until the night I broke it. It was late, well past midnight, when I saw him. Not a shape, not a shadow, not one of those tall, faceless figures waiting still in the tide. This was a boy, 15 at most, thrashing desperately against the water. His arms flailed as waves crashed over him, his head bobbing beneath the surface, mouth open in a soundless scream. The flashlight beam caught his face for half a second. Salt-streaked hair, eyes wide, skin pale. A living person drowning, I didn't think. My body reacted before my mind could. I grabbed the flotation buoy, clattered down the tower ladder, and sprinted across the sand. My boots dug deep with every stride. The air cut sharp and cold in my lungs, but all I saw was that boy going under. "Hold on!" I shouted, breaking the rule with the very first word. My voice carried across the surf, and the boy's head jerked toward me before vanishing again beneath the water. I plunged into the waves, the cold biting into my skin instantly. Salt filled my mouth, stung my eyes, but I kicked hard, arms slicing through the black water. The buoy knocked against my chest as I swam. I reached him, or what I thought was him. My hands grasped shoulders slick with seawater. His body jerked against mine, but it wasn't thrashing anymore. It wasn't fighting to breathe. It dissolved. The shoulders melted into my grip like wet sand. The arms crumbled in my hands. His face broke apart, the scream collapsing into a gurgle that became foam. I was left clutching a cloud of black water, thick and stinking of rot. Panic surged through me. The buoy slipped away, spinning out into the waves. I kicked backward, gasping, coughing salt and bile. My skin burned where the black water touched it as though it carried acid. I fought to the shore, dragging myself onto the sand. My arms trembled. My chest heaved with every ragged breath. But worse than the pain, worse than the fear, was the knowledge of what I had done. I had broken the third rule. The handbook's words thundered in my head as I collapsed on the sand. Do not attempt rescue after sunset. I rolled over, coughing seawater, spitting out strings of salt. My arms stung as if dozens of tiny knives had sliced into them. When I looked, angry red welts were already swelling across my skin, patterned like veins of coral or branching roots. They pulsed faintly beneath the moonlight. I staggered back to the tower, dripping, shivering so hard my teeth clattered. The light above buzzed, dimmed, and then blazed again. I collapsed into the seat, clutching my arms, staring down at the welts spreading slowly up toward my shoulders. They didn't fade with dawn. By morning, the marks had grown darker, almost black, and my flesh around them felt hot, infected. I wrapped them in bandages, hoping no one would notice, but the pain lingered, deep, burning in a way that no ordinary wound should. That day, I asked Evan, the other guard, if he'd ever tried to break a rule. He stared at me for a long time, his jaw tight. Then he shook his head. Don't, he said. Just don't, I pressed him, desperate. What happens if you do? His eyes flicked to the sea, then back to me. You don't get a second chance. He walked away before I could ask anything else. By the next night, the welts had spread down my chest, curling like ink across my ribs. They throbbed when I climbed into the tower. Each breath felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was thickening, and then the whispers came again. But this time, they didn't call from the surf. They came from inside me, from the burning lines on my skin. We have you. You broke it. You are ours now. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the words pulsed beneath my palms, reverberating through my skull. I tried to stay still, to obey the remaining rules, but I could feel the weight of the sea pressing closer. At one point, I caught my reflection in the tower window. The glass was warped from the salt air, but not enough to change what I saw. My eyes, my own eyes, were darker than they should have been, the pupils too wide, swallowing the color. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw movement in them. Tiny ripples, as if my gaze itself were water. I staggered back, knocking the chair over. The tower creaked beneath me, and for a moment I thought it might collapse. That night I didn't dare close my eyes. Not once. And when dawn came, I prayed it wouldn't be too late to undo what I had done. But even as the sun rose, I knew. The sea never forgives. The night after I rescued nothing, the town felt different, as if the air itself had rearranged. People moved with a wary quickness, glancing at the shoreline in a way that suggested they felt the sea's eyes on them even in daylight. I tried to hide my arms under my jacket, but the heat of the welts throbbed against the fabric. The bandages itched and smelled faintly of salt and something older, like copper and seaweed left to rot in a closed cellar. I thought the pain might teach me to obey. Instead, it taught me new ways to hear the ocean. Before, the whispers had been distant, like radio static. After that night, they were layered, multi-toned, some voices pleading, some laughing, some singing. They had begun to seep into the small hours of my day, too. I would be sweeping the deck of the tower and hear a chorus beneath my feet, or stocking the first aid kit and catch a phrase threaded through the clink of metal. The town clerk would speak to me, and a second voice would finish his sentence in my head, soft and wet, as if mouthing from below. Evan didn't want to talk about it. He avoided me at the ranger station, used rote phrases we'd learned for emergencies and nothing more. He was flatter than usual, a man hollowed by fear into the shape of habit. Once, I found him staring at the horizon for so long that the skin around his eyes had grown raw, as if the salt wind had sandblasted him while he watched. When I asked if he needed a break, he barked a laugh that had no humor in it and shoved his hat back on. His hands were trembling when he tapped the radio. The town council called a meeting. They wanted to reassure visitors, to publish statements about safety, to show they were in control. They asked for numbers, for statistics to comfort the worried. The lifeguards gave them what we had: patrol logs, rescue reports, dates. We left out the parts about chanting tides and faces in the surf. It felt oddly professional the way we sanitized the truth. The council praised our efficiency and thanked us for keeping the beaches open. The phrase, "business as usual," drummed in my ears like a tide rhythm. That afternoon, a storm rolled in faster than the weather report suggested. Clouds came up from nowhere, dark and heavy, and the temperature dropped with an almost deliberate speed, as if something was sucking the warmth out of the air. The tide rose earlier than scheduled. I strapped the tower light tighter, checked the fuel twice, and paced the wooden platform until my boots left calluses on the boards. When the storm broke over the bay, it didn't scream. It settled like someone closing a heavy door. The beach was empty. No tourists, no laughing children. Not even the stray couple who liked to drink wine on the dunes. The waves were angry but strangely polite, rising in neat intervals, then pulling back, as though they were taking measurements. I watched them count in the pattern I'd come to dread, and the voices came, steady and clear, speaking not to me, but to each other in the language of tides. Something changed that night inside the water. The surface broke open like skin. A column of black foam rose, taller than a man, and in its center something turned. It was a shape that refused to be a body, a mass of twisting limbs and pale, wet faces that rotated like a bad clock. When it faced the tower, the sea seemed to bend away as if in deference. The structure of the world shifted by inches, a small rearrangement, but enough. I felt it in my teeth. I think the sea was testing us. Testing me in particular. As the column of foam stood, the chant around it swelled until the tower vibrated. The light overhead flickered violently. My hands clenched the railings until my knuckles whitened. I thought of the handbook and every absurd, terrifying line it contained. Do not whistle after dark. Do not answer. Keep the light burning. Never turn your back. The rules felt, in that moment, like small wood planks held together with rusted nails. Fragile, but perhaps able to keep something at bay if you braced them right. I should have kept watching. I should have taken the binoculars and burned the column into my memory. Instead, fatigue and fear and a numbness that comes from being watched for too long closed my eyes for half a second. It was the shortest lapse, but it was fatal. When I opened them, the column of foam was gone and the water was marked with rings, concentric scars that expanded outward like the wake of a diver. One ring intersected with another, and where two rings met, the tide lifted in a way that made the sand tremble. Something large and heavy moved below the water at that spot. There was a sound beneath my feet, a dull thud transmitted through the boards, as if a giant hand pressed down on the earth. The tower shuddered. A shape breached the surface, and for a moment, all the ocean's disguises fell away. It was not human. It was not animal. It was something older. Rounded, barnacled, and slick with layers of anemone, but with features arranged in such a way that my mind tried to call it familiar. Eyes, maybe, or holes that wanted to be eyes. Mouths, perhaps. Rings of teeth like the ridges of a nautilus, but welded together into a wider grin. It smelled of brine and decay, and something metallic I could not name. Each inhalation made my stomach roll over. It did not swim so much as it undulated, the way a river moves when a rock is shoved into it. It circled the tower once, and I felt the pull like tide against my ankles. The sea sank in a small wave beneath it, and then the thing dove and vanished into a silence deeper than any I had known. I wrote down everything in the log that night. Dates, times, my heartbeat measured against the lighthouse clock. I wanted to prove to myself that what I had seen was real, not just a feverish fragment. The ink wobbed across the page, and each stroke looked like a confession. I underlined certain words, column, ring, breach, until my hand cramped. By dawn, the town smelled like wet rope and fish. The council met again, in smaller circles, eyes shadowed, mouths thin. They sent divers out to search the point where the surface had broken, but the sonar reports were useless. The instruments found nothing but a deep pocket of cold water. The divers came back pale and silent, muttering about currents that sucked, and the way the sea felt like it wanted to hold your head down forever. They refused to return to that spot after that first day. The water seemed to keep a memory of something then. An indentation in the temperature, a loneliness that tasted of rust. In the days that followed, the ocean's behavior threaded into every part of town life. Boats stayed moored. Fishermen mended nets in the morning and then set them aside as if the sea itself had asked for a pause. People crossed the street to avoid walking the boardwalk. Children were kept indoors, their laughter replaced by the hum of televisions playing old comedies on low volume. At the grocery, neighbors exchanged glances over the heads of the canned goods, as if we were all agreeing not to name the same thing. For me, the world narrowed to a series of calculations. How long could the welts on my arms hold without spreading? When would the chanting voices grow from words into motion? How many nights could I sit in the tower before the sea decided I had watched long enough? I couldn't stop watching. I had to. Watching felt like the only thing I could do to keep from being pulled under. But the knowledge was a double-edged knife. The more I observed, the less I felt safe. The sea had turned from neighbor to predator, and its eyes, those fathomless, patient eyes, had fixed on me. It was only a matter of time before the tide for now. Evan was the first one I saw disappear. He'd always been the quietest of us, never lingering after shifts, never joining the others for drinks or the late-night bonfires. He carried himself like a man already half-haunted, the kind of person who saw too much and decided silence was the only defense. Maybe that's why he lasted as long as he did, but in the end, silence wasn't enough. The night it happened, the sky was a smudged gray. Clouds stretched thin across the horizon like worn fabric. The air was heavy, oppressive, charged with the kind of static you feel before a thunderstorm, but without the storm itself. I climbed the ladder to my tower, my arms still sore and raw from the welts that hadn't healed, and settled in for what I thought would be another endless vigil. Across the beach, I saw Evan pacing near his tower. He should have been inside, light burning, eyes fixed on the surf like the rest of us. But he wasn't. He was restless, moving along the shoreline as though looking for something. His flashlight bobbed across the sand, a pale imitation of the tower light above him. I grabbed my binoculars, watching his every step. He carried no buoy, no rope, no radio. Just himself and the stubborn belief that walking the sand at night was safer than it was. The handbook screamed in my head, "Do not patrol alone after dark. Do not leave the tower when the tide is in." I wanted to call out, but the rules bound my tongue. If I shouted his name, the surf might shout back. If I whistled, something else might answer. I gripped the railing until my knuckles burned, willing him to return to the tower. He didn't. Instead, Evan stopped at the water's edge, staring out at the black horizon. His shoulders rose and fell as if he were breathing too hard. Then slowly he stepped into the surf. My heart slammed against my ribs. "No," I whispered, useless. The water lapped at his boots, climbed to his knees. He kept walking. His flashlight beam cut jagged lines across the waves, then dropped suddenly into the dark as the water reached his waist. I couldn't look away. My body shook, every nerve firing in panic, but my eyes stayed locked on him. The rules told me to stay in the tower, and some deeper instinct told me leaving would only mean joining him. The sea reacted before I could think further. A shape rose from the water, faster than any current should allow. It wasn't one of the still figures I'd seen before. This was movement, sudden, violent, purposeful. Something massive and slick, too quick for the eye to define. It wrapped around Evan's waist with a spray of foam and yanked. His scream cut through the air, high and sharp, a sound that didn't sound like it belonged to him at all. It echoed off the dunes, bounced against the wood of my tower, and lodged deep inside my chest. The flashlight he'd been holding flew into the air, tumbling end over end before splashing down. Its beam flickered once, twice, then vanished under the waves. Evan thrashed, arms flailing, head breaking the surface only to vanish again as whatever had him pulled harder. His screams warped, turning to gurgles, then silence. The water closed over him with a final, merciless rush. And then there was nothing. No bubbles. No body, no sign of struggle.
Just the sea, rolling back and forth as if it had never been interrupted. I sat paralyzed in the tower, breathing like a trapped animal.
The rules on the wall loomed behind me, their words drilling into my skull. Do not attempt rescue after sunset. My muscles screamed to run, to dive after him, to drag him back. But I knew what would happen. I had broken a rule once before, and the scars still burned on my arms. Evan had broken more than one. The sea had taken its payment. I stayed there until dawn, eyes locked on the place where he vanished. The gulls returned with the light, circling overhead as if nothing had changed. People would come to the beach again soon, families, couples, children, and they would never know a man had been swallowed whole only hours earlier. When the sun finally rose high enough to bleach the sky, I climbed down from the tower. My legs were unsteady, my hands numb. I walked the shoreline, searching for any trace of him, his flashlight, his radio, even a scrap of clothing. There was nothing, not even footprints. The sand where he'd stood was smooth, untouched, as though the sea had erased him not just from the water, but from the earth itself. By noon, the council announced Evan was missing. They didn't ask me for details. They didn't want them. They listed his name quietly, almost reverently, then changed the subject to staffing schedules and tower coverage. No mention of the scream, the struggle, the way the sea itself had risen to claim him. Just another man gone, another name to be etched on the plaque in the square. I wanted to scream at them, to shake them, to tell them what I'd seen. But I knew it wouldn't matter. They already knew. They'd known for decades. That's why the rules existed in the first place. That's why no one broke them. Because when you did, you didn't come back. That night, I climbed the tower alone, my hands shaking as I flipped on the light. The beam swept across the water, steady and bright, a fragile defense against the darkness waiting out there. And as the tide rolled in, the whispers returned, louder than ever. One for the sea. One for us. One for balance. I closed my eyes, gripping the rail until the wood bit into my skin. Evan was gone. The sea had taken its payment, and I knew, with a certainty that hollowed me out, that it wasn't finished. The morning after Evan vanished, I walked the shoreline again. Not because I thought I'd find him. By then I understood the sea didn't return what it claimed, but because I couldn't sit still. My body moved on its own, tracing the line where waves licked the sand. The gulls wheeled overhead, shrieking like they knew a secret no human wanted to hear. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was driftwood, scattered in strange patterns. Thin, dark lines sprawled across the wet sand, sharp and deliberate, not the random curves left by tides. As I drew closer, I realized they weren't scraps of wood at all. They were letters. My name, carved into the beach with a precision no human hand could achieve, each line cut deep and straight as if pressed by something heavy. The sea foamed gently against the edges, but the water didn't wash them away. They remained perfect and clear, glistening in the morning light. I froze, every nerve screaming. The rules had warned me not to answer voices, not to acknowledge figures, not to whistle. But they hadn't said anything about writing. Whoever had left this knew the loophole. They knew how to call without sound. I crouched, brushing my fingers just above the grooves. The letters pulsed faintly with cold. The sand beneath them was damp, darker than the rest, as if the message had been burned in rather than drawn. I stumbled back and nearly fell. Behind me, a group of tourists strolled the beach, laughing, snapping photos. None of them looked down. None of them noticed the letters beneath their feet. They walked right across my name, their sandals scattering sand, but the marks didn't fade. The beach ignored them. It had been meant only for me. That night in the tower, I couldn't stop staring at the sand. The beam of my light swept over it again and again, searching for more marks. For hours, nothing appeared. Then, just after midnight, I caught movement. The surf receded farther than usual, pulling back in a long hiss. And when it returned, new letters trailed the waterline, written in the same heavy cuts as before. Come closer. My blood ran cold. The voices I'd heard whispered that command countless times, but seeing it carved into the earth made it undeniable. The sea wasn't just speaking, it was insisting. I clutched the railing, heart hammering, fighting the pull of the words. My legs twitched as if ready to climb down, to obey, to walk across the sand and step into the black water. But the handbook flared in my mind, louder than instinct. Never turn your back. Never leave the tower when the tide is in. I stayed. The words lingered until dawn, etched bold and unbroken. By the time the sun rose, they had vanished, washed clean as if the sea had never written at all. But the next night, they returned, and the night after. Each time the message changed. Why do you watch? Don't be afraid. We are waiting. The letters grew larger, stretching the length of the shoreline. Sometimes they curved in spirals, overlapping, as if more than one voice had carved them at once. Once I swear I saw the sand shifting as I looked, lines etching themselves in real time, dragged by invisible hands. I stopped eating. Sleep was impossible. Every part of me was consumed by the messages. I started bringing a notebook into the tower, copying them word for word, as though recording them would keep me sane. But writing them down only made them louder in my head. The townspeople knew. I could see it in their eyes when I walked into the store or down the street. They avoided speaking to me directly, but their gazes lingered too long, pitying, fearful. Some whispered to each other, glancing at my arms still wrapped in bandages. I realized they weren't looking at me. They were measuring how long I had left. Evan's disappearance was barely mentioned. His name was added to the plaque, but no one spoke it aloud. In this town, the sea was allowed its due, and questioning it was useless. Everyone understood the balance, even if they hated it. One afternoon, I approached the old woman at the corner store, the one who had called me a tower rat. I asked her outright what the letters meant. She stared at me with eyes like tide-worn stones and said only, "It knows you now." Then she turned away. That night, the message was longer. "You already belong to us." I slammed my fists against the railing, shouting into the empty air, "No!" My voice cracked. The sound carried out over the waves, and the moment the word left my mouth, I regretted it. The sand below rippled as if something massive moved beneath it. The letters sank deeper, gouges widening, dark water bubbling up through the grooves. The sea answered, not with whispers this time, but with a roar, the waves slamming against the shore with unnatural force. I staggered back, clutching the wall of the tower, as the water rose higher, crawling closer to the base. For a moment I thought it would swallow the tower whole. Then just as suddenly the tide retreated, dragging the sand flat behind it. When it was gone, the letters remained. Soon. I collapsed into the chair, shaking uncontrollably, my throat raw. I knew then that ignoring the words wasn't enough. They were escalating, pushing harder, demanding more, and the worst part was how a piece of me wanted to obey. There's something about being singled out, about being noticed by something vast and ancient. It carves a hunger into you. Part of me longed to climb down, to step into the surf, to see what waited below. I hated myself for it, but the pull was real. By dawn, the letters were gone again. The sand lay smooth, the sea deceptively calm. Tourists arrived with towels and umbrellas, laughing as if the beach were harmless. Children built castles in the same spot where the words had been carved. I stood above them in the tower, watching, and wondered how long I could keep resisting before the sea wrote the final command. The warning came as a color first. At dusk, the water should have been the usual iron gray, the dull back of the bay swallowing the last of the light. Instead, it began to glow, at first faint, like a smudge of red lipstick on the horizon, then a line, then a bleed. The whole surf ignited in a slow, sickly crimson that crawled along the shoreline as if the sea itself were bleeding out into the sand. I thought. For a moment, it was some stupid tourist prank, chemicals dumped from a boat. A flare, something explainable. But the smell that rose was not smoke or fuel. It was the heavy metallic tang of blood mixed with brine, and beneath it a sweetness like rot that made my stomach roll. The light didn't come from above. It came from beneath the surface, and whatever sat under the water had decided, all at once, to show itself. From the tower, the effect was surreal. The red light washed over the beach and painted everything a horrific flat color. Seafoam looked like froth stained with wine. The gulls flew low, their wings ghostly silhouettes against the blood-colored tide. For a terrifying second, the town looked shrunk and small, a photograph filtered through some terrible lens. Then the faces appeared. They were everywhere, dozens, then hundreds, arcing beneath the water like moons pressed against glass. Pale faces floating just under the surface, mouths parted, eyes open and black and hungry. Some bobbed close enough to see the whites of teeth. Others clustered in groups, stacked like sardines in a tin. Faces so many they were a moving, breathing map of grief. The light from under the water haloed them, making their skin look porcelain and wet, as if they'd been pulled out of the deep and left on display for some cruel catalog. I felt my knees go weak. The handbook rules, those thin, indelible lines, suddenly felt like a collar tightened around my throat. Do not answer. Do not rescue. Keep the light burning. Never turn your back. They had been my margins for living, but the Red Sea made them feel like prison bars. The more I obeyed, the more I watched, and the more I watched, the clearer the faces became. They weren't all strangers. There were shapes I recognized. An old man who ran the bait shop, a girl who used to sell lemonade at the boardwalk, a fisherman whose son had disappeared the previous summer. Their faces were slack with water, but their eyes found me as surely as any living person could. The boy I had tried to save months ago, if that sinking, crumbling thing could ever be called the same, swam in a small cluster with others, like a rotating asteroid field of drowned memories. When their mouths opened, no sound came that I could hear, and yet the whole tower felt pressed with speech. They moved in currents, shifting and rearranging, forming lines and then breaking into grids. Sometimes they rose close enough that I could see small things tangled in hair, beads, buttons, a child's hair clip. One face drifted with a piece of fabric stuck to the cheek, part of a school uniform, faded and familiar. The sea was a museum, cataloging the town's losses and parading them in red light for my private viewing. The beam of my tower light swept over them, and they shimmered but did not flee. They seemed to relish being watched, to feed on the attention like some terrible plant that blooms in darkness. When my light paused, their eyes turned toward it as if in conversation. For the first time, I felt observed not as duty but as prey. The faces were not asking for rescue. They were making an inventory. The rhythm of the tide changed with the blood. Where it should have lapped and retreated in patient intervals, it now pressed forward in pulses, each swell revealing more faces, each recoil exposing bodies half buried in the shallows. The sound of the waves was louder than ever, a low, rolling hum undercut by a wet sucking that set my teeth on edge. The air tasted of salt and iron, and a hint of something that made me dizzy if I breathed too long. At some point the chanting began. It started soft, like a throat clearing in the deep, then swelled into a chorus. Not quite voices, more like a resonance, a harmonic multiplication of the same syllables I had learned to dread. When the chant found its form, it sounded like name-calling. Syllables found and held too long. Syllables stretched until they bled into one another. My name, layered and repeated, curled under my skin. You watch, you watch, you watch. The effect was not so much to demand as to seduce. I put the binoculars to my eyes, wanting to be clinical, to document, to be the professional lifeguard who reports what he sees. The glass fogged with my breath, and when I lifted it, the faces had turned. Closer. Cold water shifted around the base of the tower, tugging at the stilts with a small, testing pull. The sand below my feet vibrated in tiny tremors like the floor of a sleeping beast. I should have called it in, radioed the commander, rung the bell, told them what the sea had become. But the town was quiet. The receivers were smoking with interference. But more than that, a carcass of logic had settled over me. If you call attention, the sea might answer directly to you. The rules were not only instructions. They were a pact, fragile as paper but older than the council that printed pamphlets. It felt as though those who enforced the rules did so to keep the sea's appetite predictable. If the appetite's notice slipped to me, perhaps I would be the course it consumed. Down on the sand, a figure rose from the crowd of faces and stepped, halting, malign, onto the shallow. It was the bait shop owner, arms linked with the fisherman's boy, though I knew neither could walk. They moved like a pair of reeds in a current. The fisherman's boy looked right at me and impossibly mouthed two words I recognized from prayers I'd heard all my life. Come home, my mouth filled with sand and blood and a memory not mine. I felt an absurd urge to answer back, to shout that I was watching, that I had tried to keep them safe, that the rules had hurt me and helped me both. The urge to speak was violent, like an animal lurching for meat. I gripped the rail until my hands ached, tasting iron on my tongue. Then something else happened. Not visible, not with binoculars or light, a softness came over the shoreline, as if a hand smoothed the sand, as if something huge was pressing down the world to make room. The red light intensified, turning from wine to the color of open wounds. Faces clustered, making shapes, making patterns that my brain wanted to read as words but refused. And in that pattern I saw it. A lattice, a map, a set of instructions with no translation. I made the mistake, my terrible human mistake, of lowering my gaze to the plaque in the town square. It was a reflex. Names drew me, like moths to flame. I saw Evan's name there now, new and plain. Below it, another name I recognized, a local woman who had gone missing years ago. The plaque, pale and clean, hummed with the same rhythm the tide made, as if each letter was a bead in a chain. The sea matched that chain tonight. Something in me crumbled then. I had been watching as if performing a duty. Watching had become an act of worship. I had been the devout, the sentinel, the one who kept vigil. The red tide made that vigil into prayer and the faces into priests. The rules that had seemed to protect me were the shackles I used to keep time. When you hold a slow-burning coal long enough, you learn to ignore the heat. But the coal will still scar. A small craft, a rowboat, floated out of the red, appearing like a black hole with oars. An old man I remembered, Jasper, who used to play harmonica at the pier, sat in it. He paddled slowly, and as if in a trance, he hummed an old shanty. The song was thin and out of time, but the faces twitched as if listening. Jasper's boat moved between the pale circles of faces and left wake like a blade. I shouted, then for the first time that night. Not a professional alarm, not a radio call, but a ragged human yell. No, Jasper, come back. The sound felt absurd, applied to the whole world like a bandage. Jasper lifted his head, and for an instant his eyes met mine. They were glassy, empty, but there was something else, a flicker of recognition, like a dying light. He opened his mouth, and in place of a reply, a string of bubbles escaped, rising and popping at the surface. The boat slipped past the reach of the tower light, and Jasper vanished between faces. I fell to my knees, hands scraped raw on the wooden rail. The chant swelled into something like laughter, a wet, gurgling sound that made part of me laugh too, in a way that was not mine. My body wanted to move, to climb down and follow them into the cold red. Every instinct to survive warred with a need to join, to be part of whatever this convergence was. It felt less like death, and more like the completion of a sentence you had been drafting for years. But the rules remembered me. Do not answer when the sea calls your name. My name rolled in the chant, and the faces pointed it like a conductor's baton. I had to choose. Obeying had brought Evan to the sea, but disobeying had already left marks on my skin and soul. I understood that the rules were not justice. They were trial by motion. They demanded compliance but promised nothing. They were a ledger the sea read aloud when it was hungry. I stayed. I did what the handbook commanded with the last stubborn part of me that wanted to live. I kept the light burning until dawn bled the red away and the faces receded like a bad tide, sliding clean into black water with only the gentle rise and fall of foam to mark their passage. When the sun finally came up, the beach looked normal in the way a burned house looks normal from a distance.
There were no bodies on the sand, no oars or broken wood.
Only a thin, oily sheen on the tide line, and a scattered handful of shells that looked bright against the scarlet memory of the night. I climbed down from the tower, legs shaking, and found the shore littered with small things. Bits of fabric, a harmonica strap, a child's plastic bead, a corroded coin. They glittered in the weak light like evidence left at a crime scene. No one else seemed to notice them. People came to stroll and sunbathe within an hour. Towels spread on the same ground where faces had floated until a few hours ago. The plaque in the square had another name added that morning, neat and final, and when I walked past it I almost expected to see my own etched into brass. For a long time afterwards, every time the tide moved, I flinched. Every siren in the distance twisted my stomach. The red would come back in my dreams, a luminous flood where I could see every face up close and feel 100 cold fingers lift from the depths to point at me, and the rule would be etched across my vision like a brand. Do not answer. On that night, the rules turned inward and betrayed their promise. The sea had shown me its ledger and collected its dues. The chart on which townspeople balanced their days had shifted. The ocean no longer simply took the ones who trod carelessly into it. It had begun to demand payment with intention, and whatever passed for mercy in this place had become an accounting that never ended. I had watched, and that watching had a cost. The sea had taken its payment. The handbook had always been a lifeline for me, unsteady, cryptic, terrifying, but still a line between me and the dark. I clung to it because it was all I had, but that night, staring at the rules pinned inside the tower, I realized something that made my stomach twist in knots. 2 of them contradicted each other. Never turn your back on the water, even when the tide recedes. Do not look too long into the surf after dark. It was a paradox. I had to keep my eyes on the sea. I also had to look away. Both commands pulsed with the same authority, the same promise of punishment if I disobeyed. But obeying one meant betraying the other. For weeks, I'd done my best to balance them. I scanned the waves, but I forced myself to blink often, to tear my gaze away at intervals. But after the red tide, after the faces had risen by the hundreds, after Jasper's boat had slipped silently beneath the glow, the contradiction grew unbearable. The ocean demanded attention now. It wanted my gaze fixed on it, unbroken, reverent. Every time I tried to glance away, the voices hissed louder as if mocking me. Why do you look away? Why do you pretend you do not belong to us? But when I did keep my eyes locked on the surf, I felt myself unraveling. Minutes bled into hours, hours into endless nights. The longer I stared, the more the world narrowed until it was only water. The line of the horizon blurred. The faces in the tide multiplied, not hundreds now, but thousands, each one familiar in ways that clawed at me. I would see my father's eyes, my mother's mouth, a childhood friend's crooked nose. The water stitched together memories and drowned them, parading them back to me as proof that I could never look away. It was killing me either way. On the 10th night after the red tide, exhaustion made the choice for me. My eyes had been locked too long, my muscles frozen. A cramp spread through my back like hot wire, and in reflex I turned, breaking the first rule. For less than a second, my gaze left the sea. The response was immediate. A crack rang out beneath the tower, sharp as a gunshot. The wood groaned, trembling. The tide surged forward, foam hissing against the stilts. Something massive slammed into the legs below, rattling the entire structure until I thought it would collapse. I scrambled to hold the railing, staring back at the water, gasping apologies into the dark. The sea accepted none of them. A shape rose directly beneath me, pressing against the surface until I could see its outline bulging upward. It was too wide for the tower's shadow to contain, too long for my mind to make sense of. Hundreds of hands, or things that looked like hands, spread across the underside of the surf, palms up, fingers curling. They scraped against the stilts, long nails dragging furrows into the wood. The whole tower shuddered under their grip. I kept my eyes on them, forcing myself not to blink, barely able to breathe. And for a moment it worked. The hands froze. The tide calmed. The tower settled back into place. Then the second rule whispered through me. Do not look too long into the surf after dark. I was staring, frozen, drowning in my own gaze. My reflection swam back at me, warped in the water's skin. My face looked wrong, stretched, smiling when I wasn't. The longer I looked, the more the reflection moved independent of me. Its mouth opened, wider and wider, until the skin around it split. Water poured from the hole, rushing upward, flooding the space between me and the sea. I tore my eyes away in horror, snapping my head to the side. Another crack, louder. The tower leaned an inch, 2 inches. Salt spray hit my face like spit. The stilts groaned as if bones were being bent. There was no way to win. If I stared, the reflection ate me alive. If I looked away, the tower crumbled. I was trapped in the contradiction, the rules devouring me no matter what I chose. That night stretched into eternity. I alternated between looking and looking away, my head jerking back and forth, each choice bringing new punishment. When I stared too long, I saw things in the waves that weren't there before. Rows of teeth breaking the surface, black eyes watching from inches below, mouths repeating my name in silence. When I turned away, the tower shook harder, the stilts splintering beneath invisible weight. The rules weren't safety anymore. They were a game, a trap laid by the sea to break me piece by piece. At some point, I don't know when, I collapsed into the chair, too weak to keep watch. My eyelids drooped, my head lolled, and in the blur between waking and sleep I heard it. A new voice. Louder than the rest. Choose. The word echoed in my skull, vibrating my bones, shaking me awake. The sea didn't want obedience anymore. It wanted a decision. One rule or the other. Look or turn. Watch or flee. I staggered to the railing, gripping it hard enough to splinter the wood beneath my nails. My throat was raw, my vision blurred with salt. The ocean spread before me, infinite and waiting, faces bobbing just beneath the glow. I didn't know which choice would kill me faster. I only knew that either way, I was already being dragged under. So I stared into the surf, my eyes burning, my breath ragged, whispering through cracked lips. I choose to watch. The sea rippled. The faces grinned. The tower groaned. And I knew I had made the wrong choice. The sea had been whispering to me for weeks, calling in voices stolen from memory. But what happened that night was no whisper. It was a song too large, too layered, too alive for human throats, a song that wanted to swallow me whole. I'd chosen wrong. The moment I admitted aloud that I would keep watching, the water seemed to quicken. The tide pressed harder against the stilts of my tower. My light flickered in staccato bursts, unable to cut through the black expanse. The faces beneath the surface no longer drifted idly. They turned as one, rolling their eyes upward to fix on me. Their mouths opened, and in perfect, unnatural unison, they began to sing. It wasn't melody. It was vibration, resonance, a hum so low it shook my ribs. Then came higher notes, layered on top like waves stacking, until the entire sea thundered with voices. Some were cracked and wet as if choking. Others were childlike, clear and sharp. Hundreds of tones, thousands, weaving together into a single wall of sound that pressed against my skull until my teeth ached. My name threaded through the chords. At first faint, then louder, then repeated over and over like a chorus line. Aliyan, Aliyan, Aliyan. I staggered back from the railing, clutching my ears, but it didn't matter. The song wasn't entering through air. It was inside me, reverberating in my blood, filling the spaces between each heartbeat. I tried to hum to block it, to create my own sound, but my voice was drowned instantly, absorbed into theirs, repurposed as another note in their growing choir. I fell to my knees, gasping. My arms still bore the branching welts from the night I broke the third rule, and now they pulsed in rhythm with the music. The black veins writhed beneath my skin like strings being plucked. Every note they sang tugged at me, deeper and deeper, until my body trembled on the verge of tearing apart. Through the tower window, I saw the sea change. The waves weren't random anymore. They pulsed in rhythm with the choir. Each swell lifted at the exact same time as a crescendo. Each crash against the sand synced perfectly with the lower tones. The ocean itself had become an instrument, and the drowned were its choir. Then I saw the dead. They rose from the water one by one, not just faces now, but whole bodies. Translucent, bloated, swaying figures, their limbs dragging as though tangled with invisible strings. They stepped into the surf, their mouths gaping wider, the song pouring out of them in watery, gurgling tones. Their eyes locked on me as their voices joined the greater whole. Evan was among them. He stood at the front, Pale and trembling, his mouth stretched open impossibly wide, black water spilling from his throat as he sang. His eyes were glazed, but when they met mine I felt something stir, recognition, or maybe just blame. His arms lifted as if reaching for me, each finger bent unnaturally backward, nails blackened to points. I sobbed his name, breaking another rule. His song deepened in reply, louder, shaking the tower until dust fell from the rafters. I knew then that the choir wasn't just noise. It was a summoning. Each note pulled something larger from the deep, something that needed all their voices together to breach the surface. The drowned were calling their master. The horizon cracked. That's the only way I can describe it. The line where sky met sea bent upward, splitting like a seam. A bulge rose, enormous, casting shadows even in the dark. The song swelled, 1,000 drowned throats shredding themselves to lift the sound higher. I clutched the rail, my body trembling under the vibration. My breath rattling in my lungs. The bulge broke open, and something vast stirred beneath. I couldn't see its full shape, only glimpses in the churn. A ridge of barnacled skin, an eye wider than the tower window. A mouth lined with rows upon rows of jagged teeth that seemed to stretch farther than physics should allow. The water boiled around it, red foam glowing like embers. The drowned fell silent all at once, their mouths snapping shut. The choir ended abruptly, leaving only the hum of the deep, a silence so sharp it cut. Then one by one they began again. This time softer, almost tender. Join us, join us. Join us! The sound filled my mouth before I could stop it. My lips moved on their own, echoing the phrase, the melody weaving itself into my voice. Panic surged as I realized I was singing with them. My throat burned, my lungs constricted, but the sound poured out anyway. I tried to fight it. I clawed at my neck, bit down hard enough to draw blood, anything to break the rhythm. But the more I resisted, the louder my stolen voice became. I was part of the choir now, my tone merging seamlessly into theirs, my body vibrating in time. The tower groaned beneath me, leaning toward the water as though drawn by gravity. The light above sputtered, buzzed, then died completely, plunging me into red-lit darkness. The rules had failed. The last barrier had fallen. Below, Evan and the others stretched their arms upward, palms out, beckoning me to descend. Their mouths shaped words I couldn't hear anymore over the chorus, but I knew what they meant. Your time, your turn, payment owed. The great shape in the horizon shifted again, and for the briefest instant, its massive eye surfaced, fixing on me. The sight stole every thought from my head. It was bottomless, ancient, and certain. It was the eye of something that didn't see me as human, didn't even see me as prey, only as a note in its endless song. I collapsed against the wall, tears streaming, throat raw from the sound I couldn't stop producing. The rules, the contradictions, the warnings, they'd been scaffolding, buying me nights, nothing more. The sea was always going to demand this. The drowned choir was simply the announcement of my turn. And when my voice cracked at last, when my throat gave out, I heard the sea sing louder to cover my silence, because I had been part of it now, because once the sea has your voice, it never gives it back. The choir didn't stop when the dawn came. It faded into the bones of the beach, into the marrow of my skin, but it never really ended. Even when the tourists returned with their umbrellas and sunscreen, laughing as they splashed in shallow water, I could hear the notes beneath the surface. The drowned sang in silence, and only I seemed to notice. I didn't sleep that day. My body wouldn't let me. Each time I closed my eyes, the sound swelled, threatening to split my skull. The black welts on my arms had spread, curling like ink across my chest, and when I touched them, my fingers came away damp with salt. I wrapped myself in fresh bandages and climbed the tower again at dusk, knowing the next night would be worse. The handbook had said nothing about choirs, nothing about red tides or bodies rising from the sea in unison. But one line whispered louder now than all the others. Never turn your back on the water. Even when the tide recedes, I obeyed it with desperate precision, staring at the surf until my vision blurred, my eyes dry and raw. I dared not look away. The first hours of night passed uneventfully. The sea rolled in quiet rhythm, the kind that fools tourists into thinking the beach is safe. But the silence was heavier than usual, weighted, as if everything was holding its breath. The tower creaked under me, groaning with each gust of wind. My hands trembled on the railing, though whether from fear or fatigue, I couldn't tell. Around midnight, the tide rose higher than it should have. The waves swelled not with wind or storm, but with something deliberate. The water pressed farther up the sand, licking at the base of the tower. Foam spread across the beach like reaching fingers, retreating slowly, leaving behind patterns in the sand that looked too much like writing to be chance. Ours. The letters glistened briefly, then were erased by the next surge. I clutched the railing harder. The rules told me not to answer, but the sea didn't need me to. It was already advancing. By the second hour, the voices returned. Not whispers now, not a song, but something worse. Breathing, heavy, wet inhalations rising with each wave. The sound filled the air, syncing with the water's rhythm until it felt as though the whole ocean had lungs. Each inhale drew the tide higher, each exhale pulled it back, but never quite as far. The sea was breathing itself onto land, inch by inch. The tower shook with each pull, the stilts groaning under the assault. My chair rattled across the wooden floor and I pressed my back against the wall to keep steady. The light above flickered, then steadied, its glow thin and weak against the vastness below. That was when I saw them. Not faces this time. Not the drowned choir. Something larger. Dark ridges moved just beneath the surface, circling the tower. They rose and fell in steady arcs, too symmetrical to be waves. The water bulged with their movement, rippling outward. My breath caught as one ridge broke the surface, revealing barnacled skin, slick and black, covered in strands of kelp that draped like hair. Another ridge surfaced beside it. Then another. The shapes circled tighter, closer, the water churning white around them. I counted 5 before I stopped, my stomach heaving. They weren't swimming. They were enclosing. The breathing grew louder, echoing inside my skull. The tower leaned slightly, as if the sand beneath its legs was eroding. I pressed my forehead to the wall, whispering the rules to myself, clinging to them like prayer. Never turn your back. Keep the light burning. Do not answer. The third hour arrived, and with it, the first strike. Something slammed into the base of the tower, hard enough to knock me to the floor. The wood shrieked under the pressure. My lantern toppled, rolling across the planks, spilling light. I scrambled to grab it, clutching it to my chest as though it could shield me. The tower tilted, groaned, then steadied again. Below, the water boiled. Shapes surged, massive, impossible. Their ridges cut through the surface, circling tighter, tighter, until I felt like a mouse surrounded by wolves. Another strike. This time higher, against the stilts. The whole tower shuddered, boards cracking. Splinters rained from the ceiling. My chest seized with terror. One more blow and the tower would collapse, dragging me into the surf. I staggered to my feet, clutching the railing, screaming into the night. Not words, not answers, just raw sound, a plea to no one. The sea responded with a roar, louder than any wave I'd ever heard, a sound that rattled the glass in the lantern. The 4th hour bled into the 5th, each one worse than the last. Strike after strike pounded the tower. My arms ached from gripping the railing. My throat was raw from gasping. The water rose higher, licking at the floorboards now, salt spray bursting through cracks. And then the chanting returned. Not the choir this time. Not the drowned. A deeper voice. Singular, enormous. It vibrated through the water, through the sand, through the tower itself. It spoke in no language I knew, but the meaning hit my bones all the same. Time is over. Payment due. The tower leaned dangerously, wood splintering, stilts bending. My body pressed against the wall as it tilted, the lantern swinging wildly from its handle. I knew I had minutes at best before it collapsed. Desperation clawed at me. My eyes darted to the handbook nailed to the wall, its edges curling with damp. I tore it free, flipping through the water-stained pages, searching for anything, any rule I'd missed. Any loophole. That's when I saw it, a line I hadn't noticed before, scrawled faintly in pencil at the bottom of the last page. Faded, nearly erased, but still legible. When the tower falls, do not scream. My chest clenched. What kind of rule was that? Why hadn't I seen it before? The 6th hour struck, and with it, the final blow. The sea surged all at once, rising higher than any tide I'd seen. The stilts cracked, snapped, and the tower lurched violently. My body was thrown against the wall, the lantern shattering, flames hissing as seawater swallowed them. The tower collapsed into the surf. Wood splintered, glass shattered, salt filled my lungs. I plunged into the water, spinning in darkness, boards crashing around me. My arms flailed, reaching for anything, but all I felt was cold. The welts on my chest burned hotter than fire, glowing faintly in the dark. The water pulled me down, deeper than the shore should allow. My lungs screamed, my body convulsed, but I remembered the last rule. When the tower falls, do not scream. I clenched my jaw, biting my tongue until blood filled my mouth. The urge to release a cry, to expel the terror building in my chest was unbearable, but I didn't scream. I held it inside, swallowing the pain, the fear, the truth that I was lost. And then, in the silence of my restraint, I felt them. Hands. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, closing around my body. Cold, wet, strong. They lifted me, dragged me deeper, threading me through currents I didn't understand. My eyes snapped open against the salt, and in the murk I saw them. The drowned. Their faces calm now, their mouths closed. They weren't singing anymore. They were carrying me into the deep hours. The sea does not rush when it has you. It drags. It pulls in slow, steady currents, as if savoring the inevitability of your descent. That's what I learned in those hours after the tower collapsed. The drowned carried me downward, not roughly, not violently, but with terrible purpose, as if escorting me to a destination already chosen. I didn't fight. I couldn't. My chest burned, my lungs screamed, but the pressure of dozens of cold hands kept me still. Their faces blurred around me in the dark water, pale moons gliding past, eyes open but lifeless. Evan drifted closest, his mouth sealed now, no song pouring out. His gaze was hollow, yet it held me. A warning, or a welcome. We sank past where the sand should have been, past the shelf of the bay, deeper than the depth charts said existed. The water grew heavier, pressing into my skull, into my bones. Darkness swelled thicker, swallowing even the faint light of the surface. And then, as if a curtain had parted, the world below revealed itself. The seabed stretched vast and flat, but it was not barren. It was carved. Grooves and trenches ran in precise patterns, spirals intersecting with lines, circles within circles. Symbols larger than any building, etched deep into the floor, glowing faintly with red light. They pulsed in rhythm with my heart, or perhaps my heart had adjusted to match theirs. At the center of it all, a chasm yawned. Wide, bottomless, ringed with jagged stone. The drowned bore me toward it, lowering me gently as though presenting an offering. That's when I heard the voice. Not the choir, not the whispers. The voice, singular, ancient, it filled the water like thunder. You have obeyed. You have broken. You have chosen. Now you will hear the last. The drowned released me, and I hovered in the current above the chasm. My lungs convulsed, demanding air, but I was too far gone for breath to matter. The welts on my chest blazed white-hot, flooding me with a strange clarity. For a moment I could understand the voice not as sound but as thought. The rules had always been fragments, written by men who survived long enough to scratch warnings into paper. But they had not told me all of them. There had always been one more. The one no handbook dared print. When the sea calls your name, do not answer. I had read it, scribbled in marker, half dismissed. I thought I understood, but I hadn't. Not until then, staring into that bottomless rift, with the ocean's mouth whispering my name over and over. Alian, Alian, Alian. The sound rose from the chasm itself. Not from mouths, not from drowned throats. From the deep, from whatever waited below. The voice was so large, it bent the water around it. So vast, it shook memories loose from my skull. Childhood moments bubbled upward, running barefoot across the sand, my father's hand clutching my shoulder, my mother calling me inside. All of them warped, hollowed, claimed by the sea's repetition. I clamped my teeth, holding back. But the urge to respond was unbearable. The voice wasn't simply calling, it was pulling. It tugged at the root of my being, the part of me that needed to be acknowledged, to be real. To answer was to exist, and the longer I resisted, the more I felt myself unravel, The drowned circled around me, silent, their mouths sealed. They knew. They'd all answered once. That's why they were here. The sea called again, louder. My name stretched into a scream, reverberating through the water until it felt as if the whole world was built from those syllables. A lion. My jaw trembled. My lips parted. The scream clawed at my throat. And then, I remembered the pencil scrawl at the bottom of the handbook. When the tower falls, do not scream. It hadn't been about fear. It had been about this moment. About holding silence when the sea demanded sound. About refusing the answer. I bit my tongue until blood filled my mouth. My body convulsed, but I refused to give voice. The water churned violently, the chasm widening below, black currents surging upward like hands reaching to seize me. The drowned jerked back suddenly, as if in pain. Their pale faces rippled, mouths opening in silent wails. Evan's body twisted, pulled between the currents. The patterns on the seafloor blazed brighter, lines of red light flaring into spirals. The voice roared again. Answer. My lungs collapsed inward, demanding release. My chest convulsed. Every instinct screamed to shout, to cry, to beg. My throat tore itself raw in silence, and still I did not answer. The chasm buckled. A column of black water surged upward, wrapping around me, spinning me in its current. My body twisted, bones cracking under the force. My vision blurred red, then black. But I did not answer. When the current finally released me, I drifted limp above the glowing lines. The drowned had fled into the dark. The voice quieted, receding like a tide. The chasm sealed itself, jagged stone knitting shut until only faint light leaked through the cracks. And then there was silence. Silence so deep it felt holy. I floated there, suspended, my body broken, lungs still burning. For a heartbeat I thought I had won, that resisting had saved me. Then I felt the shift. The rules had not saved me. They had changed me. The silence wasn't freedom. It was binding. The welts across my chest pulsed one last time, then split open. Salt water poured from them, not into me, but out of me. My body hollowed, filled with currents. My throat opened, and though I had not answered, I sang. A low, endless hum, the same resonance the drowned had carried. I had kept my silence. I had not answered. And for that, the sea rewarded me with a place in its choir. Not as a victim, not as prey, but as something in between. The last rule wasn't meant to save me from the sea. It was meant to save the sea from me, until I was ready. Now I was ready. The drowned returned, drifting closer, their mouths moving again. Evan floated near, his gaze empty but calm. Together they opened their throats, and the song rose. I joined without hesitation, my voice weaving into theirs. The rules had brought me here. The final rule had sealed it. When the sea calls your name, do not answer. I hadn't, and now my silence belonged to it forever. Silence has a shape. It isn't the absence of sound. It's the fullness of something else, heavy and endless, pressing in from all sides. That's what I learned in the hours after the sea claimed me. I was not floating anymore. I was suspended, caught between water and air, between breath and drowning. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't on the seabed or in the tower. I was somewhere in between. The horizon curved in impossible ways, folding back on itself like a ribbon of smoke. The water shimmered around me without weight, sometimes heavy as stone, sometimes light as mist. I tried to move but felt no body, only presence, like a shadow untethered from its source. The drowned surrounded me, drifting in slow circles. They didn't move like before, jerking, grasping, pulled by invisible currents. Here they were steady, suspended in the same half-space I occupied. Their mouths were closed. Their eyes, blank as old glass, glowed faintly with reflected light. They weren't corpses here. They weren't people either. They were something in between, something the sea had chosen to keep. Evan floated nearest. His features were softer now, less ruined by the water. He didn't look at me with horror or recognition. He looked through me, past me, as though I were just another fragment drifting in the tide. When I tried to speak his name, no words came. Only vibration, a note. And then I realized I was still singing. The hum I had released when the welts split across my chest hadn't stopped. It reverberated through this liminal space, binding me to the others. Each of us was a note in the choir. Together we created the resonance that held this place intact. The sea had kept me. I don't know how long I drifted there. Time had no meaning. Sometimes I thought I felt the sun above, faint warmth pressing through the veil. Other times I sensed the cold crush of the deep, the pressure of miles of water pressing inward. Days and nights blurred, bent, erased. All that remained was the song, endless and slow, carrying me forward without destination. Occasionally, I glimpsed the world I'd left. Shapes blurred across the veil, distant and fragile. Tourists walking the sand, children splashing in the surf, the town glowing faintly with its meager lights. They couldn't see us, couldn't feel the weight of the voices beneath their feet. But we were there, watching, humming, patient. The plaques in the square grew heavier with names. I saw them sometimes, flashing like reflections, each new letter carved not by hand but by tide. The sea kept its records, and the town obeyed, silently adding to the list, pretending it was just another storm, another accident. What haunted me most wasn't what the sea had taken. It was what it hadn't. My body was gone, yes. My voice belonged to the choir, but my thoughts remained. My fear, my anger, my shame. The rules had never promised salvation. They had promised transformation, and transformation means something of you survives to remember. I remembered the first night in the tower, the figure standing waist-deep in the surf. I remembered the whistle that was answered. I remembered the boy who dissolved in my arms, the welts that spread across my chest, the faces in the red tide, Jasper's boat vanishing into the choir. All of it was still inside me. The sea keeps its dead, but it also keeps their memories. Sometimes, in the lull between songs, I hear fragments of the others. Not words, not thoughts, but impressions, flashes of who they were. A fisherman's pride in his catch, a mother's last sight of her child, a guard's guilt as the tide dragged him under, Evan's resignation the moment he stepped into the surf. They are pieces, broken and incomplete, but they remain. We are what the sea keeps. There are moments when the veil thins and I feel the pull of the surface. The choir grows quiet, and in the silence I sense the voices above, the living, calling each other, laughing, crying. Once I felt someone say my name, not the sea's way, but the human way, warm and clumsy. It nearly tore me upward, but the current held me down. The sea never lets go of what it keeps. The worst is when new ones arrive. It happens without warning. A scream echoes faintly through the veil, distorted, brief. Then a shape tumbles into our circle, flailing, thrashing, until the pressure stills it. The choir absorbs them quickly, the hum deepening to welcome the new note. And I watch as their fear melts into the same calm blankness I see in all the others. The sea keeps adding to its collection. One night, if nights mean anything here, the veil parted wider than before. I saw the tower rebuilt, fresh wood nailed into place, a new guard climbing the ladder. Young, hopeful, oblivious. A laminated sheet hung by the window, crisp and new. The same rules, the same warnings. My rage surged, twisting through the song. The rules weren't salvation. They were bait. They kept the cycle turning, each new guard obeying just long enough to be claimed. I tried to shout, to warn. My throat opened, my voice rose. But all that escaped was the hum, vibrating steady, woven into the choir. The sea doesn't allow warnings. It keeps silence dressed as song. Still, in the quiet moments, I test it. I shape the hum differently, bending it into notes that don't fit. Dissonance, rebellion. The others twitch when I do it, their eyes flickering with faint light, but the current always drags me back into harmony. The sea is patient. It knows I will break eventually. What it doesn't know is that patience works both ways. The sea keeps us, but it also keeps secrets. I've seen them carved in the trenches below, the spirals, the circles, the glowing patterns. They aren't random. They are maps, instructions, promises. The drowned don't see them anymore. Their eyes are too clouded, their memories too thin. But I remember, I watch, and I think I understand. The final rule had been about silence, about refusing to answer. But maybe there is another, unwritten, hidden deeper than all the rest. When the sea keeps you, remember what it forgets. The sea forgets resistance. It forgets the moments when its choir falters, when a note strains against the current. It forgets that memory can be sharper than silence. I don't know if I can escape. I don't know if escape even means life anymore. But I know this. The sea doesn't own all of me yet. It can keep my voice, my body, my song, but my memory is mine. And as long as I remember, I am not entirely lost. The tide rises. The choir hums. The rules repeat themselves across the veil. New gods climb new towers, clutching their laminated sheets, whispering the words that have bound us for decades. The sea will keep them too. It always does, but maybe one day someone will hear the dissonance in the song. Maybe they will notice the fracture, the note out of place. Maybe they will remember that the sea doesn't just take, it keeps. And if it keeps, then perhaps something can be taken back. Until then, I drift. I hum. I remember. I am what the sea keeps.